When Americans think of World War II, they usually think in terms of heavy industry, real steel, real armor, real blood, real logistics. Factories in Detroit producing M4 Sherman tanks, Ford and Chrysler converting automotive assembly lines into war machines, Liberty ships mass-produced in shipyards along the coast, explosions in the Pacific, Europe reduced to rubble. The image is steel and fire, not theater and paint. But in the shadow of this enormous industrial roar, the U.S. quietly built something else, something that did not weigh 40 tons like a real Sherman, something that did not fire projectiles, something that did not even need gasoline, a weapon made not of metal, but of imagination, nylon, portable compressors, and human psychology. This weapon was the Ghost Army, and this concept, deception as a battlefield weapon, is one of the most under-discussed American innovations of the entire war. Americans know about the atomic bomb. Americans know about the B-17. Americans know about Normandy. But Americans rarely think of empty rubber tanks and fake core transmissions as the weapon that held the German army in place long enough for real American divisions to break through. Why? Because it sounds unbelievable. It sounds cartoonish. It sounds like fiction. But it was reality. The U.S. military created a fake army, a real unit, with real soldiers, but their purpose was not fighting. Their purpose was to create illusions so convincing that German generals would move actual armored divisions to the wrong place, sometimes 20, sometimes 50, sometimes 150 kilometers away from the actual point of attack. These illusions did not simply annoy Hitler. These illusions redirected resources. There is a difference. Annoyance is small interference. Redirection is grand strategy. And the Ghost Army did redirection on industrial scale. This was not a small trick played once. This was a system, a method, a doctrine of industrial deception operating continuously during 1944 and 1945. It was a ghost formation, officially called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and it was assembled from artists from art schools, sound technicians who had worked in New York studios, advertising designers, set builders, radio operators, engineers with abstract imagination. In other words, not traditional military men. This is important for American viewers because this is one of the rare examples in World War II where the U.S. Army recognized creative civilian talent as a weapon and redirected that talent into the battlefield. It was the same American cultural energy that could produce Hollywood illusion, but put into war logic. For years before the war, Hollywood had been building illusions for cinemas. Fake streets, fake brick, fake cars, fake explosions, fake everything, but realistic enough to make audiences feel authenticity. The Ghost Army transferred this capability to Europe, but now the audience was not moviegoers. The audience was the Wehrmacht. This is possibly one of the most American things in the entire war, the belief that creativity can be weaponized. Now, why did U.S. commanders invest in this? The context matters. In the final year of the war, 1944 into 1945, American divisions were stretched across massive fronts. Germany was desperate, but still heavily armed. The U.S. could not physically move tank divisions fast enough to create every deception position using real vehicles. If you needed to show force in 5 places, but you only had real divisions for 3, then you needed a way to simulate 2 phantom divisions. This is pure math. You could not be everywhere unless you made the enemy believe you were everywhere. And deception is always cheaper and faster than steel. One inflatable Sherman weighed around 90 pounds. A real Sherman tank weighed about 33 tons, around 66,000 pounds. The cost difference between making one inflatable decoy and manufacturing one real armored vehicle was astronomical. This is the heart of the Ghost Army logic. The U.S. realized that 1. You don't have to build real tanks. 2. You only have to convince the enemy that tanks are present. This is war through representation, not through physical force. And this approach for American intellect is not simply cunning, it is cost-efficient. Imagine the German perspective. A Luftwaffe pilot flies reconnaissance. He sees columns of tanks. They have correct shadows. The geometry is correct. They look like real armored formations positioning behind hedgerows. If the photos are grainy, if the visibility is low, if the pilot is stressed, if the camera is old,
Those illusions become reality in his interpretation. Commanders on the ground see radio chatter consistent with tank divisions. They detect signals that match frequency behavior of a real armored formation. They overhear troop movements. Deception works because the observer wants to believe what he sees when it matches his expectations. Hitler expected Americans to mass tanks before attacking. Therefore, when he saw American tanks, he assumed they were real. The Ghost Army exploited this expectation. This brings us to the American industrial mindset of the time. Mass production, assembly lines, large-scale planning. In many ways, the Ghost Army was a psychological assembly line, a mass-produced illusion engine.
It is not surprising that some of the earliest members of this unit were artists, trained to think in terms of composition, perspective, color, shadow. These were not simple painters. These were individuals trained to understand how the human eye interprets shape in space. To deceive a German reconnaissance pilot at 600 meters altitude, you need to know how a tank looks from that angle, not how a tank looks in a museum. This was art weaponized. And it also shows a difference between societies. Germany was steeped in classical, hierarchical, uniformed military tradition. America was younger, more adaptive, more experimental. Germany preferred tradition. America preferred improvisation. This improvisation, this flexible, pragmatic problem-solving, is exactly what made Ghost Army possible. Now, it is also important to talk about secrecy. Because the Ghost Army was not recognized publicly for decades, many details were classified. Veterans received almost silent recognition. In a way, the Ghost Army was suppressed by the image of real war. Rubber tanks do not look heroic enough for cinema. They do not make the same dramatic impression as real tanks in Normandy, but strategically, they saved American lives. Every time the Ghost Army caused Hitler to move a panzer division to the wrong sector, that meant fewer American infantrymen died in the real attack axis. Deception is silent but efficient. It is not visible in combat photography, but it drastically reshapes outcomes. The Ghost Army operated near the front lines. Soldiers there were often within artillery range. These illusions were not safe theatrical performances. They were performance art under fire. Another key point, the Ghost Army did not operate alone. They synchronized with real units. Their fake operations only worked because American commanders built operations around them, and the Germans respected what they thought they were seeing. That is ultimate success. When your enemy gives you respect because he believes your illusions. And this is why the Ghost Army is a story not only about deception, but about understanding human perceptual limits. The German army was not stupid. The Wehrmacht had excellent intelligence officers, but they were still human. They were still working with partial data. They were still trying to interpret reality quickly. So the Ghost Army did not have to create perfect illusions. They only had to create illusions that matched German expectations under stress. In war, perception is shaped by fear, fatigue, incomplete information, and time pressure. A Luftwaffe analyst in 1944 might have had only 20 seconds to examine a reconnaissance photograph during an air raid. In that moment, a rubber tank is indistinguishable, and that is enough. This is the power of illusion. It is not required to be perfect. It is required to be good enough to influence the enemy's next decision. And decision, not material, wins wars. That is why Ghost Army is an example of strategic improvisation, a psychological multiplier. Rubber, plastic, and air multiplied into strategic consequences. And this first part is necessary because we need to establish something important for the American viewer. This unit is not comedy. This unit is not funny inflatable cartoon tanks. This unit is one of the most intellectually sophisticated U.S. operations of the European theater. It represents a fusion of industrial mass production, artistic creativity, military logistics, psychological manipulation, radio engineering, sound design, and camouflage science. It is the apex of interdisciplinary war. And it demonstrates the American worldview. If a problem exists, there is always a new angle to attack it from, even if that angle is not through more steel, but through more imagination. This is why the Ghost Army must be understood not as an anomaly, but as a natural expression of the U.S. technological culture of the mid-20th century. This story is not about sneaky tricks. This is a story about strategic creativity. And now, the next part will start breaking down the tools themselves, the inflatable tanks, the fake artillery, the compressors, the way these illusions were transported and staged. The Ghost Army's capabilities were rooted in a remarkably simple insight. If the enemy's information about you comes through sight and sound, then manipulating sight and sound can change enemy decisions. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but executing it under combat conditions required an entire toolkit: physical props, transportation, power generation, recording devices, camouflage materials, radio traffic mimicry, and the human technique to stitch all of that into a believable scene. In this section, we break down the major categories of equipment and explain, in practical detail, how each part worked and why it mattered. 1. Decoys, inflatables, plywood rigs, and painted frameworks that read as armor from ground and air. There were 3 broad families. A. Inflatable decoys. These were nylon or rubberized fabric shells shaped like tanks, trucks, or artillery pieces, and inflated with portable pumps. The advantage was mobility and speed. A small crew could pack a deflated rig in a truck, move into position, and inflate it in minutes. Inflatable decoys produced convincing silhouettes, cast realistic shadows at certain sun angles, and when arranged in formation, produced photographic signatures similar to real units. Physically, an inflatable Sherman might weigh in the order of tens of kilograms when deflated and occupy a small volume in a transport truck. When inflated, it could reach the correct height and profile to fool an aerial reconnaissance camera. The inflatables were often painted to match the typical mud, grime, or winter white of the theater, and seams and inflation valves were concealed to reduce the chance a low-resolution reconnaissance photo would pick them out. Inflatable decoys were inexpensive relative to a real tank. Producing a nylon shell and inflation hardware cost a fraction of the steel, engine, and armament of an M4 Sherman.
B. Plywood and framework decoys. For situations that demanded more detail, or where inflatables were likely to fail, high wind areas, or where close visual inspection from the ground was possible, crews built folding wooden frames covered with painted canvas or plywood panels. These could support extra features, a faux turret, painted tracks, or mock antennae, and could be open-framed to reduce weight while preserving shape. Designers understood perspective. If the enemy observation point was known to be at altitude X and azimuth Y, the decoy could be arranged so the most convincing profile faced that direction. That kind of geometric planning made a wooden mock Sherman read correctly in reconnaissance photos, even though, up close, the materials were obviously fake. C. Low signature detail. Tracks, mud, and weathering. One reason decoys worked had nothing to do with art and everything to do with realism in small details. Real mechanized units left signs, tracks in mud, dust plumes, stains from oil drips, and disturbed vegetation. The Ghost Army crews added those signs artificially. They dragged boards to mimic track impressions, mixed and applied mud to lower hulls, and used smoke pots to simulate engine exhaust. Sometimes they positioned actual empty fuel drums, piled sandbags, and set up small canvas shelters to give the visual scene depth. These low-cost details were crucial in convincing a hurried reconnaissance analyst that the scene represented real, functioning armor rather than a staged display. 2. Mobility and logistics. How the props moved. Decoys are only useful when they can be deployed quickly and relocated to suggest movement. The Ghost Army adopted logistics that prioritized lighten and move. Crews traveled in ordinary transport trucks, craftily packed with deflated inflatables, folding frames, painting kits, pumps, and camouflage nets. Inflatable rigs could be packed in standard GMC trucks and offloaded in the field, inflated with gasoline-driven compressors or hand pumps, and arranged in a formation in a single afternoon. The whole operation, from arrival to a photographed formation, could be executed in a few hours. Then, after reconnaissance flights had flown over and the propaganda or deceptive operation had been achieved, crews dismantled and packed up, often overnight, and moved to fresh positions. Speed mattered for survivability. A static decoy left in place for long risked being shot at, probed by enemy ground patrols, or simply discovered by chance. 3. Sound, portable sound stages, and the sonic artillery. Visual decoys were only half the deception. Sound is far more subtle and far more persuasive cue for military decision-makers, because the presence of sound suggests function. Engines rumbling means vehicles are mobile. Command chatter suggests a staff is active. The Ghost Army developed specialized mobile sound systems to mimic the audio signature of entire armored formations. A. The sound trucks. A key innovation was studios on wheels, trucks containing record players, amplifiers, and an unusual assortment of recorded effects. These trucks could park hidden in woods or behind hedgerows and play high-volume tracks that simulated convoys, engine noise, vehicle starts and stops, and even the sound of tank guns firing at range. The recordings were made in the United States by sound engineers who recorded actual tanks, trucks, and artillery. Playback systems used horn speakers, and sometimes multiple directional loudspeakers, spaced to create the illusion of movement, a sound cue moving from left to right to mimic a column driving past. Hidden in hedgerows or laced along roads, the speakers could be arranged to create accurate spatialization, something that not only fooled human ears on the ground, but also deceived German acoustic detection teams or listening posts. 3. Frequency, amplitude, and audio sequencing. The sound crews did not just play random noise. They understood that tank engines have characteristic harmonic content and RPM patterns. A Sherman idling at 400 RPM sounds different from a moving Sherman at 1600 RPM. Sound technicians created layered tracks that included idling, acceleration, gear changes simulated by different recordings, and background noises such as radio static or shouted orders. They controlled amplitude so that the apparent distance of the formation changed over time. A single column's approach could be simulated by starting the audio faint and increasing its volume while sequentially activating speakers arranged along a route. This level of acoustic choreography required field rehearsals and careful timing with reconnaissance flight schedules.
C. Psychological layering, including incidental human noise. In addition to mechanical sounds, recordings contained human noises, laughter, quarrels, the creaking of canvas, or the metallic clank of storage boxes, because those small cues made the scene feel lived in. Military analysts are, by training and habit, sensitive to those human markers. Hearing the human sounds alongside engine noise convinced many German listeners that they were dealing with an active unit, not an empty stage. 4. Radio deception, fake nets, scripted traffic, and call sign engineering. Visual and audio ruses were effective, but the Ghost Army's deception matured into an integrated program when it started mimicking radio traffic. In World War II, radio traffic was one of the most important forms of intelligence. Signals intelligence officers recorded and analyzed call signs, frequencies, and message rhythms. They knew typical battalion radio practices, reporting schedules, and the length of messages exchanged between HQ and subordinate units. The Ghost Army inserted itself into that informational ecology. A. Creating believable radio nets. Instead of silence, decoy formations generated radio chatter consistent with armored units. Trained operators used proper call signs and adhered to the reporting protocols the Germans expected to overhear. That meant using the right tempo of voice traffic, the right abbreviations, and the right procedural language. The operators used prearranged scripts designed to mimic the interaction between a battalion headquarters and its companies. Authenticity here was procedural rather than factual. The actual content of messages was often deliberately mundane, but the pattern matched. B. Signal security and mistakes. Paradoxically, some realism required mimicking human errors too.
In real nets, operators occasionally repeated, mumbled, or made small timing errors. Perfectly polished recordings risked standing out to signal analysts who knew operational radio traffic had a texture of imperfect speech. The Ghost Army's radio teams introduced small imperfections to avoid the uncanny valley of perfect but fake communications. C. Coordination with allies' radio deception. Radio deception was most powerful when coordinated with Allied signal intelligence operations and aerial reconnaissance. If reconnaissance photographs showed a formation where there was corresponding radio chatter, analysts were more likely to interpret both cues as corroboration. This cross-model confirmation, sight, sound, and signal, is why a simple inflatable and a tape deck could influence high-level German decisions. Multiple sensory channels converged on the same false conclusion. 5. Camouflage science and the art of perspective. A technical requirement for visual decoys was not merely shape reproduction, but the manipulation of perception through camouflage. Camouflage with the Ghost Army was not just hide something, but present the right shape to the right observer. Crews used painted canvas, natural vegetation, and even schematic shadowing to ensure that the decoy read correctly from the likely vantage point of an aerial spy plane. A. Understanding aerial geometry. Planners considered the typical altitude of reconnaissance aircraft, angle of the sun at expected flight times, and prevailing weather. If reconnaissance flights typically flew at 3,000 feet with sunlight from the west at 10:30 a.m., decoys were oriented to cast shadows consistent with that geometry. This required adapting the three-dimensional form of a mock tank to create shadow lobes in the right places. Artists did shadow mapping experiments on the ground before committing a formation, using mirrors and temporary lighting. B. Paint, contrast, and tonal values. Visual realism depended on tonal contrast more than color. Early black-and-white reconnaissance photography prioritized luminance information. A decoy that matched the gray-level signature of a real vehicle would photograph convincingly even if its color was slightly off. Artists therefore focused on tonal values, using washes and stippling to emulate mud streaks and grime that would translate into the correct grayscale tones on film.
C. Dynamic camouflage, movement, and disassembly. Effective deception required not just looking right static, but behaving plausibly. Formations would move over time. Crews sometimes dismantled and reassembled decoys progressively along a road or field to simulate movement, adding small piles of brush or cleared tracks that made the progression look earned. That choreography required crews to be both logistical technicians and stagehands. 6. Power, compressors, and field engineering. Keeping inflatables inflated, powering amplifiers, and running record players in the field required reliable power sources. Ghost Army units used a mix of portable gasoline generators, battery banks, and manually operated pumps. A. Generators and fuel logistics. Generators were rated for the requirements of the audio system, amplifiers, turntables, and auxiliary effects. A typical field generator might produce a few kilowatts, enough for speakers and lighting, but fuel consumption constrained how long a deception could be maintained. This meant the unit had to plan for refueling, ensure noise discipline, generator noise could compromise a site if too loud, and place power equipment behind concealment to reduce detection. B. Pneumatic systems for inflatables. Inflatable decoys relied on compressors. Early compressors were gasoline-driven and could inflate a Sherman mock-up in a matter of minutes if properly sized. Crews carried spare hoses and patches. Punctures were common in rough terrain, so repair kits were essential. The logistics team also planned for rainy conditions, where fabric could be heavier and more easily damaged. Dust, weather, and maintenance. Props deteriorated in the field. Canvas stretched, paint flaked, speakers got clogged with dirt. The Ghost Army's effectiveness depended on maintenance crews capable of patching inflatables, repainting scuffed surfaces, and servicing record players and amplifiers under field conditions. The maintenance burden was non-trivial.
A single well-maintained formation could fool reconnaissance flights for days, but neglected props became obvious fakes in hours. 7. Personnel and training. Artists, sound engineers, and military technicians. No toolkit works without trained operators. The Ghost Army recruited an eclectic mix of personnel: artists from leading art schools, professional sound engineers, theatrical set designers, radio operators with both military and civilian experience, and standard infantry and truck crews for movement and security. A. Interdisciplinary training. Units trained together in camps where mock operations were staged. Painters learned how radios worked. Radio operators learned the basics of perspective so they could place decoys with an eye for aerial camera angles. Sound engineers learned how to camouflage speakers and disguise generator noise. This cross-training produced teams that could improvise in the field. B. Tactical discipline. Despite being imaginative, these teams were soldiers and needed to maintain discipline. They learned to operate under fire, to rapidly disassemble under threat, and to maintain radio discipline in operational spaces. They had to balance the aesthetic needs of deception with military necessities. Camouflage that worked in a studio might be unacceptable close to an active front. C. Documentation and rehearsal. Detailed field manuals emerged from experience. Crews followed checklists: determine observer vantage point, orient decoys, place speakers, run a rehearsal with a reconnaissance schedule, and have extraction plans. Rehearsals sometimes involved live reconnaissance flights by friendly aircraft to test the visual signature before the operation was executed for enemy observation.
8. Limitations and countermeasures. The tools were powerful, but not invincible. Bad weather, low clouds, or sharp-eyed ground patrols could reveal fakes. High winds could tear inflatables. Skilled German intelligence officers learned to look for telltale signs: identical tire tracks, a lack of true mud patterns, or recorded audio with unnatural cadence. The Ghost Army adapted by varying placement, adding more organic detail, and integrating decoys with genuine logistical evidence. Empty ration boxes, spent shell casings placed carefully to increase credibility. 9. Cost-benefit consideration. Compared to the resource cost of a real armored division, the Ghost Army's tools were cheap. A single Sherman breath, the cost to manufacture a leather and rubber inflatable, and a set of speakers was a small fraction of a tank's production cost. Beyond money, the key metric was strategic impact per unit cost. An inflatable that caused the enemy to hold back a panzer division for even 48 hours could change the local balance of casualties and operational tempo. The return on investment for deception was therefore evaluated not in dollars, but in maneuver space and reduced casualty. Examples and field anecdotes. Tactical anecdotes illustrate how these tools functioned in practice. Crews would arrive at dusk, unroll inflatables, inflate them with whispering compressors, add mud and brush for realism, and position speakers behind a hedgerow. At dawn, they would play a layered audio track, simulating an armored column. A reconnaissance plane would take photographs. By noon, German command would adjust force deployments based on the images and intercepted radio chatter. Overnight, the Ghost Army would deflate, break down, and drive 50 kilometers to set up a new deception elsewhere. These rapid deployments were made possible by the combination of lightweight props, rehearsed teams, and simple but robust field engineering. Conclusion to Part 2. The Ghost Army's toolkit proves an important point. High-level strategic effects can be achieved through relatively modest technical means if those means are deployed with insight into enemy information systems. The combination of inflatables, plywood frames, sound systems, radio nets, and camouflage science created an integrated sensory deception capability that was cheap, flexible, and remarkably effective. Understanding the physical tools, their construction, logistics, and use
is essential before we can appreciate the higher-order operational art at play when the Ghost Army synchronized sight, sound, and signal into operations that changed the course of local battles. Radio was the bloodstream of modern armies in World War II. Frontline units, divisional headquarters, corps staffs, all of them depended on radio traffic to coordinate movement, request artillery, pass situation reports, and maintain the tempo of operations. Signal traffic conveyed not only content but pattern, the cadence of messages, the number of simultaneous nets, the length and timing of transmissions, and even small procedural quirks told a trained analyst what kind of formation they were hearing. The Ghost Army understood that if you could fake those patterns convincingly, you could create the auditory and informational signature of entire corps without a single real vehicle in place. This section explains the mechanics and psychology of radio deception, what the Ghost Army tried to replicate, how they engineered believable traffic, what tools and personnel they used, how enemy signals analysis worked, and how the Ghost Army countered it, and, critically, why imperfect messages often made the deception more authentic.
1. Why radio traffic mattered. To understand the value of radio deception, imagine being a German SIGINT analyst in 1944. You receive a steady stream of shortwave intercepts. Your job is analysis under time pressure. Identify units, determine approximate location, and provide recommendations, often within hours. Patterns are everything. Armored divisions generate particular patterns, frequent tactical check-ins between company and battalion, dedicated artillery fire control chatter, staff-level planning exchanges with measured, longer messages, and a web of call signs associated with specific subunits. Aerial reconnaissance produced photographic evidence. Signals intelligence produced movement and identity cues. If both sources aligned, photographs showing vehicles at grid X and intercepted chatter consistent with an armored unit operating in that grid, commanders treated that as corroborated intelligence and made operational decisions accordingly. The Ghost Army exploited this multi-source dependency, create believable radio traffic to match the visual signature, and the enemy is far more likely to believe both. 2. The anatomy of believable radio traffic. Fake radio traffic must accomplish three things. It must sound right procedurally, it must occupy the expected amount of time on the air, and it must include the correct variety of voices, accents, and minor imperfections. Procedural correctness means using the right kinds of messages at the right intervals. For example, an armored battalion sending intermittent situation reports and maneuver updates will not speak in long monologues the way an artillery coordination net might. The Ghost Army staffed experienced radio operators who had been trained not only in signal equipment, but also in military traffic procedures. They could mimic the typical schedule of calls: morning status checks, periodic contact reports, short fire control requests, and occasional higher-level coordination. Timing was critical. SIGINT units analyzed traffic volume. A sudden spike in short, sharp transmissions could indicate a mechanized unit on the move. A constant stream of administrative traffic suggests a static rear area. Ghost Army planners created traffic schedules mapped against expected enemy observation windows. If reconnaissance flights passed over at 10 and 1400 hours, radio nets were arranged to mimic the busiest operational hours around those times, so photo interpretation and SIGINT both showed congruent activity. Voice variety and small errors were surprisingly important. Perfectly scripted and flawlessly delivered recordings often failed because real human radio nets were messy. Operators stumbled, voices overlapped, background noise crept in, and procedural brevity sometimes gave way to colloquial phrasing. The Ghost Army deliberately introduced these flaws: a mispronounced locality, a half-finished phrase, a repeated group number, or a slight delay before acknowledging a call. These small flaws increased authenticity. SIGINT analysts were trained to be suspicious of traffic that was too clean. 3.
Tools and hardware used for deception. The Ghost Army used standard field radio sets combined with pre-recorded material and live scripted exchanges. The military radio sets allowed operators to broadcast on frequencies likely to be monitored by the enemy. Pre-recorded traffic was used for precise timing and repeatability. Live voices were used for improvisation and to introduce organic variety. Pre-recorded capes, played on portable recorders, were valuable for reproducing certain routine exchanges over many hours without operator fatigue. For example, a set of short situation reports that an infantry battalion might issue every hour could be recorded and played back in rotation. Operators would intermix these with live exchanges to preserve natural variability. 7. Content management, balancing the right amount of detail. One of the hardest problems in radio deception is deciding how much real detail to include. Too little, and the net is obviously empty. Too much, and the enemy could intercept inaccurate operational information that would be easily refuted. The Ghost Army resolved this by focusing on procedural and redundant content that confirmed presence without revealing sensitive truth. Scripts included status checks, logistics traffic, unit location confirmations, and tasking messages that did not disclose strategic plans. For instance, instead of transmitting a detailed order to move a particular regiment at 0300 hours, the net might carry a routine-sounding supply request, followed by a short situation report that suggested readiness without specifying intent. The goal was to create a credible aura of activity rather than provide operationally valuable intelligence to the enemy. 8. Improvisation, spontaneity, and mistake realism. Real armies make mistakes. They underestimate radio discipline. They make timing mistakes, and they improvise when plans fall apart. Ghost Army operators learn to incorporate such human elements deliberately. A scripted exchange might be interrupted by a wrong frequency call, a garbled group designation, or a hurried request for clarification. To a trained adversary, a perfectly flawless deception could actually flag as suspicious. Small, believable errors made a net feel human. 9. Operational integration, linking radio deception to visual and audio ruses. Radio deception was not done in isolation. Its real power came from integration with visual and audio ruses. If reconnaissance photos showed a formation, and listening posts heard radio chatter matching that formation's expected communications, analysts were far more likely to categorize the report as confirmed intelligence. The Ghost Army coordinated timing. Inflatables and mock positions were arranged and dressed for aerial runs at the same moment a radio net would be active, and loudspeakers would simulate engine noise. This cross-modal orchestration created a synergy. The whole was greater than the sum of the parts. 10. Counter-detection, avoiding enemy triangulation and reprisals. Broadcasting on frequencies that the enemy monitored carries risk. Enemy direction-finding teams might attempt to triangulate the source of a net. The Ghost Army employed several countermeasures, intermittency in transmissions to complicate DF fixes, placing transmitters deep within concealment and behind camouflage, and using mobile transmitters that could change location. When security demanded, pre-recorded transmissions could be played through remote speakers to give the impression of widespread emplacement, while the real transmitter remained elsewhere. In addition, the unit practiced rapid extraction techniques. If a site was suspected to be compromised, crews could dismantle decoys, silence nets, and relocate quickly, sometimes within hours. The goal was always to remain one step ahead of enemy attempts to physically verify or attack the supposed formation. 11. Examples that illustrate method. Composite vignettes drawn from unit practice. A representative scenario helps show the art in action. Imagine a deceptive operation intended to pin a German armored division near a sector of the front to prevent it from reinforcing a critical Allied crossing elsewhere. At 0500 hours, a Ghost Army contingent inflates a line of mock Shermans behind a wood line.
Crews add fresh-looking track marks and scatter empty ration tins to create the impression of habitation. By 6:30 hours, hidden loudspeakers begin playing layered engine noise rolling past a hedgerow. At 0700 hours, a radio net established a half-mile back from the decoys begins routine call-ins, company status reports, patrol returns, and an artillery registration check. A reconnaissance plane flies overhead at 0830 hours and photographs the formation. Enemy signal units intercept the radio chatter and see a call sign consistent with an armored battalion. Over the next 6 hours, German commanders reassigned reserves to the sector observed to defend against a perceived assault. At noon, the Ghost Army deflates and withdraws. The real tactical intention in the main sector is now unopposed and benefits from the enemy's misallocation.
Live exchanges required trained operators who understood enemy listening practices and could improvise within the right procedural frame. These operators would read scripts when needed and break into spontaneous calls to create the impression of an active, adaptive command structure. 4. Call sign engineering and identity manipulation. Call signs are identity markers in radio traffic. In the hands of a skilled deception team, call signs can create the illusion of unit identity without revealing real dispositions. The Ghost Army used a technique sometimes called call sign engineering, assigning plausibly authentic call signs using correct hierarchical relationships and varying sign usage to match known patterns. That meant not only inventing unit names, but ensuring subordinate nets used call signs in the expected manner. Company call signs replying to battalion call signs, fire control nets initiating calls when artillery was requested, and reconnaissance nets broadcasting location check-ins. An essential feature of call sign deception was continuity. Analysts watch for persistence. Real units tend to appear consistently over time in a region. A single broadcast with a plausible call sign is weak evidence. Persistent and patterned use of a call sign, combined with corroborating activity, is more convincing. The Ghost Army therefore created a persistent, multi-layered net. Primary call signs for headquarters-level chatter, secondary call signs for subordinate companies, and occasional ephemeral nets for tasks. This layered persistence made the enemy more likely to classify the net as real. 5. Traffic analysis countermeasures and mimicking enemy technique. The Germans did more than read call signs. They performed traffic analysis. Traffic analysis studies observable features of signals, message length, volume, periodicity, time of day behavior, and the network graph of who talks to whom, to infer unit type and posture even if messages are encrypted. Ghost Army planners had to mimic not only content, but those meta features. For instance, armored units typically generate short, tactical exchanges during certain operational tempos, pre-attack spikes, preparation phases with artillery registration, and then post-attack status reports. Deception teams studied these rhythms and translated them into synthetic traffic schedules. They also mimicked known German SIGINT expectations, using similar message lengths and repeating routine check-ins to mimic a living, breathing organization. 6. Morse code deception, dots and dashes, and the old art of telegraphy. Morse traffic remained a significant channel of battlefield communications, especially for certain nodes and in environments where voice traffic might be intercepted. The Ghost Army understood that high-level German listeners could deduce everything from the rate of Morse sending and the form of the messages. They therefore produced fake Morse traffic with proper procedural form, call signs, pro-signs, abbreviated notations, and expected sending speeds. Skilled telegraphers could mimic the typical speeds and styles of a battalion. The Ghost Army included such personnel. Even small things mattered. The precise spacing of groups and the use of standard pro signs indicated institutional practices. For example,
Certain tactical nets would use a particular way to encode coordinate changes or strike requests. Ghost Army telegraphers learned these patterns and used them to craft Morse traffic that read as authentic to enemy listeners.
This vignette captures the key features: multimodal deception, procedural radio traffic timed for observation windows, attention to visual realism, and the strategic objective: create a false front of such credibility that the enemy redeploys assets. 12. Training, doctrine, and institutional learning. Creating convincing radio deception required institution-level training. Operators were taught not only to handle equipment, but to understand enemy analysis techniques. Training emphasized 3 skills: authenticity of procedure, realism of errors, and coordination with non-radio deception elements. The Ghost Army developed checklists and rehearsal procedures, traceable sequences that integrated the timing of radio activity with aerial reconnaissance schedules and speaker playback sequences. 13. The limits and ethical dimensions. Radio deception has limits. If the enemy intercepts conflicting intelligence, say a reliable human report placing units elsewhere, they may discount signals. Overuse of deception in a single theater can also produce skepticism over time. Moreover, radio deception risks interfering with real communications if not carefully planned. There are also ethical considerations. Intentionally transmitting false content could be considered acceptable in wartime deception, but it carries risks, including collateral misinformation to friendly forces if nets are misdirected. 14. Why radio deception mattered tactically and operationally. In the aggregate, radio deception was cheap in resources, but high in strategic leverage. A handful of operators, pre-recorded tapes, and a disciplined script could produce effects comparable to moving thousands of men. That asymmetric leverage is the central lesson. In an era where commanders made decisions using multiple partial information sources, crafting a consistent, plausible information picture could steer enemy decisions at scale. Conclusion to Part 3. The Ghost Army's radio deception was not mere theater. It was a technically sophisticated, psychologically grounded, and operationally integrated practice that translated informational mimicry into real strategic outcomes. By mastering the procedural language of radio traffic, building believable call sign architectures, simulating the imperfections of real nets, and synchronizing audio and visual ruses, the unit turned empty airwaves into a force multiplier. The enemy's ears, trained, experienced, but inevitably human, were fooled not because the messages were elaborate or fanciful, but because they matched the texture and rhythm of real military life. When crafted with that degree of authenticity, false radio traffic could make an entire phantom formation sound, look, and feel as persuasive as steel on the ground. Sound was a weapon in its own right. Visual deception created the shape of a force. Radio deception created its informational identity. But sound gave the force life. When the enemy heard engines, creaking leather, shouted orders, and the distant boom of guns, the scene stopped being a photograph and became an event. The Ghost Army elevated battlefield sound into a form of mobile theater, a staged, recorded, and carefully mixed performance designed to persuade listeners that a real mechanized force was present, moving, and ready to fight. 1. The strategic logic of battlefield audio. Why was sound worth the investment? Because sound conveys immediacy. A photo suggests presence at a single instant. A radio net suggests organizational activity. Sound suggests ongoing activity across time and space. When a listening post hears a continuous rumble of engines approaching, or a column idling and revving intermittently for hours, it creates a mental model. Vehicles are there, they have crews, and they can move on demand. Sound also forces the enemy to allocate resources, anti-armor reserves, artillery, or air reconnaissance, resources that are then unavailable elsewhere. In short,
Sound multiplies the perceived credibility of visual and signals deception. It is the difference between a still-life painting and a staged play with actors moving on cue. 2. Sources and recording techniques, creating believable audio assets. The Ghost Army needed recordings of real military sounds. They got them in two primary ways: field recording real units and studio synthesis. A. Field recordings. Sound technicians traveled to training areas and recorded the actual noises of American trucks, tanks, half-tracks, artillery sections, and motor pools. They captured engine tones across speed ranges, the metallic clank of track links, idling hum, gear shifts, and the percussive blast of gunfire at distance. These field recordings provided raw material with authentic harmonic content, the complex mixture of frequencies that give a vehicle its aural identity. B. Studio synthesis and Foley. Not all needed sounds could be captured in ideal conditions, and some effects needed to be exaggerated or time compressed. Here, technicians borrowed from Hollywood's Foley tradition, creating plausible substitutes using common materials. For instance, the metallic rattle of a crude dismounting might be replicated with metal boxes and chains. The distant thud of an artillery salvo could be produced by layered low-frequency drums and reverberation chambers that added the appropriate decay tails. The key was not literal accuracy, but perceptual plausibility. Would a trained human listener believe the composite sound as the real thing at a distance? C. Cataloging and layering. Recordings were cataloged by event type: startup, acceleration, idling, passage by, halt, gunfire, and by tonal qualities: low-frequency dominant, mid-frequency rumble, and high-frequency mechanical clatter. This allowed sound designers to assemble multi-track mixes that matched the expected acoustic progression of a real column. 3. Playback hardware. The studio on wheels. Once the sounds were made, they needed to be delivered convincingly in the field. The Ghost Army built mobile audio rigs that functioned as small outdoor sound studios. A. Playback systems. Portable recorders and wire recorders provided pre-recorded material. Mechanical turntables were sometimes used, but were fragile for field conditions. Amplification used tube amplifiers adapted for mobile use. These required stable power and cooled mounting. Playback decks fed multiple channels so that audio could be spatialized across an array of speakers rather than emitted from a single source.
B. Speakers and horns. To carry sound over hundreds to thousands of meters in an open environment, and to preserve the character of low-frequency rumble, the unit used horn speakers and large diaphragm cone speakers. Horns are efficient at projecting mid and high frequencies. Large cones reproduce bass energy better. In practice, a mixed speaker array incorporating both types gave a richer aural character than one alone. Field crews concealed speakers behind hedgerows, in abandoned farmhouses, or under camouflage nets to keep the sources from being visually obvious. C. Power and amplification. Speaker systems required significant power. Typical mobile amplifiers were rated in hundreds of watts at peak output. Generators of the period were sized to supply this load, often several kilowatts, though crews had to balance loudness with operational security. Generator noise could itself betray a site. Field engineers often placed generators at distance and fed power via long camouflaged cable runs to reduce local acoustic signatures. 4. Creating the illusion of movement, sequential playbacks, and time-based sequencing. One of the most compelling uses of sound was to simulate movement over space. Sound designers employed several tactics to create the impression of a column sweeping by or of forces approaching. A. Sequential speaker activation. By placing multiple speakers along a path and activating them in sequence, crews simulated progression. If the speakers were spaced 50 meters apart and activated with timing consistent with vehicle speed, for example, a column moving at 10 kilometers per hour corresponds to 2.78 meters per second, roughly 18 seconds to move 50 meters. The sound would travel across the array in a way that matched expected motion.
Precise timing produced convincing Doppler-like changes and the distinct left-to-right source localization that humans use to detect movement. B. Volume ramping and EQ changes. As a formation approaches, the sound increases in amplitude and loses high-frequency content due to air absorption and propagation effects. Sound technicians mimicked this by ramping volume and subtly removing high-frequency content as the formation receded. Conversely, as a column approached, they boosted low-mid energies to reflect proximity. These equalization, or EQ adjustments, were crucial for perceived distance. C. Phase and arrival time manipulation. Advanced teams introduced tiny delays between speakers to simulate the arrival time differences that listeners use for localization. These interspeaker delays were kept within the order of milliseconds, tuned by ear in rehearsal. The human auditory system is highly sensitive to such micro-timing cues. Even small, consistent delays can make a sound appear to come from a specific moving source. 5. Acoustic science in the field. Propagation, attenuation, and environmental factors. Sound does not travel uniformly. The Ghost Army's engineers had to account for atmospheric and terrain effects. A. Speed of sound and temperature gradients. Sound travels at roughly 343 meters per second at 20 degrees Celsius. Temperature gradients, especially at night, can refract sound. For example, an inversion, cool air near the ground and warmer air above, can trap sound, carrying it further along the surface and making distant sounds louder than expected. Technicians used knowledge of local meteorology to choose the best times for deployment. Clear, cold nights often provided long-range propagation. High winds or heavy rain degraded clarity and made deception risky.
B. Spherical spreading and attenuation. As sound radiates from a point source, it spreads spherically and loses level at about -6 decibels for every doubling of distance in ideal free field conditions. Technicians use this predictable decay to model how loud engines would be at various ranges and adjusted playback levels accordingly. They also compensated for atmospheric absorption, which disproportionately affects higher frequency. Far sounds have less treble, so playback mixes were rolled off in high frequencies for distance simulation. C. Terrain effects. Hedgerows, buildings, valleys, and forests all modify sound. Open fields allow clearer propagation, but make speaker concealment harder. Woods can mask visual sources, but create unpredictable scattering and absorption. Sound teams performed reconnaissance to find spots where the terrain would favor the deception. For instance, a shallow valley that funneled sound toward enemy positions while hiding speakers from view. 6. Layering. The art of believable mix. A convincing audio scene is not just one track. It is a layered mix. Sound designers combined engine tracks with human sounds, canvas flapping, metallic clanks, radio static, distant artillery reports, and environmental ambiance, birds, wind rustle, to build complexity. A. Primary and secondary layers. The primary layer is the mechanical signature, the engine and movement sounds. Secondary layers add human presence, crews talking, footsteps, the slam of hatch covers. Background layers provide environmental realism, a distant dog barking, a church bell, or the hum of a different unit in the far distance. These layers give the listener multiple cues to triangulate authenticity. B. Temporal variation. Real columns are not continuous uniform noise. Engines slow for obstacles, stop and rev, and crews interact in bursts. Sound scripts included randomized variations so that repetition did not reveal artificiality. Long operations required rotating sets of variants so that the same 60-second recording did not loop monotonously for hours. C. Spatial distribution. Speakers for different layers were often separated. Engine tracks might emanate from a line of horn speakers. Human voices might come from concealed positions near a mock bivouac. Distant artillery rumbles might be played from a separate low-frequency array. Spatial distribution reinforced the feeling of depth and scale. 7. Choreography and rehearsal.
making the performance believable. A live performance, even recorded, needed careful timing and alignment with enemy observation windows. A. Dry runs with friendly aircraft. When possible, friendly reconnaissance flights would be used to test the visual and acoustic signatures. Crews coordinated speaker activation with aircraft passes to ensure that the recording sounded right from altitudes typical of enemy reconnaissance. Observers on the friendly aircraft gave feedback on how the scene registered from above. B. Timing relative to intelligence schedules. Allied intelligence had a good sense of when German aerial reconnaissance typically happened. Sound teams activated their plays to coincide with those windows. If a flight was expected at 9 a.m., the audio scene would ramp up in the prior hour to create activity that could be picked up via both sound and picture.
C. Rapid change and extraction plans. If a deception could not be sustained without risk, teams had pre-planned extraction, shut down amplifiers, deflate inflatables, and move to secondary sites. Rehearsing these moves minimized time on target and reduced chance of physical verification by enemy patrols. 8. Psychological subtleties. What makes a sound convincing? Beyond physical accuracy, certain psychological elements increase believability. A. Imperfection. Just as with radio nets, perfectly looped recordings can be suspicious. Real soundscapes have unpredictable elements, a muffled cough, a sudden shout, a gear grind. Technicians intentionally seeded these unpredictables into mixes. B. Scale cues. People judge size and distance through low-frequency content, reverberation, and the presence of high-frequency detail. Massive armored formations have a deep base foundation. Small trucks do not. Adding low-frequency energy made formations sound larger and more threatening. C. Familiarity and comparative cues. Sometimes tactics used included playing the sound of a single tank startup, followed by a greater multi-vehicle rumble, mimicking the pattern of a lead element probing, followed by the main body. This gave the listener a narrative, first a scout, then the force, which aligns with military expectations. 9. Field examples and outcomes. Operational anecdotes illuminate method. In one commonly cited style of scenario, teams would place loudspeakers along the far side of a hedgerow near a marsh. The sound of an approaching armored column, carefully ramped in volume and spatialized across 4 speakers, would carry across the marsh and into enemy listening posts on the opposite rise. At the same time, inflatables arranged in the hedgerow showed a photographic signature. German commanders, seeing both a photograph and intercepts of radio chatter and hearing the engines on their listening stations, committed a reserve division to the sector. In other cases, audio alone convinced German night listening posts to report heavy movement where none existed, drawing flak batteries or reconnaissance flights to the wrong sector. 10. Limitations, failures, and learning. Sound deception had vulnerabilities. High winds, rain, or loud ambient noise, artillery barrages, air raids could mask playback. Skilled enemy acoustic analysts recognized repetition or patterns and sometimes identified sources by backtracking generator noise or unusual timbre. The Ghost Army adapted, rotating recordings, varying placement, and combining audio with visual and SIG-int deception to reduce the risk of detection. Moreover, miscalibration could produce the opposite effect. A sound too loud, or a timbre wrong for the expected force, could call attention rather than credence. Sound designers learned to err on the side of slightly muffled and distant when in doubt, a believable hint of presence rather than an obvious spectacle. 11. Comparisons with Hollywood and legacy techniques. The Ghost Army learned from Hollywood's Foley tradition, the creation of synchronous sound effects to match on-screen action. But battlefield sound required different priorities: durability, mobility, and tactical effectiveness. Hollywood studios could control acoustics and re-record to perfection. The Ghost Army had to make immediacy work outdoors, under enemy observation, and on a limited logistical budget. The techniques, however, share the same creative core: understand the listener's expectations and deliver convincing sensory cues that satisfy them.
The legacy of these techniques persisted. Post-war psychological operations and deception units in multiple militaries studied the Ghost Army's audio playbooks. Modern electronic warfare and psychological operations still consider sound and its digital descendants as a tool for shaping perception. The Ghost Army's acoustic operations were an act of engineered empathy. Technicians worked not to deceive abstract sensors, but to persuade the human listener. They combined empirical acoustics with creative mixing, road-hardened hardware with atmospheric science, and tactical choreography with cinematic intuition. The result was an auditory illusion that could and did change enemy behavior. The success of those operations underscores a deeper truth about warfare in the information age. What matters is not only what you have, steel, guns, men, but what your opponent believes you have. Sound helped make those beliefs real. Deception is ultimately judged by results. Tools, techniques, and rehearsals are necessary, but their worth is proven only when an adversary reassigns forces, delays action, or otherwise changes plans because of what he thinks he is observing. This part examines 3 full-length case studies that illustrate how the Ghost Army translated craft into operational impact. Each case study reconstructs the planning, execution, adaptation, and outcome of a major deception episode. The aim is to show the entire life cycle of a deception operation, from intelligence and objective setting through multicellular coordination of visual, audio, and radio assets to the enemy decision-making cascade that produces real strategic effects. The case studies are organized to highlight different strategic objectives and different mixes of deception tools. The first case emphasizes large-scale visual deception to fix armored reserves. The second stresses a combination of radio and acoustic deception to mislead tactical reconnaissance. The third examines a sustained deception campaign integrated with ground maneuver to conceal a major river crossing and thereby reduce friendly casualties and time under fire. Each case demonstrates not only the technical methods, but also the human and command-level decisions that made deception tactically effective. Case Study A. Fixation at the Front, Operation Breast, a large-scale visual deception intended to pin armored reserves. Objective and strategic context. The strategic goal of Operation Breast was straightforward: keep German armored reserves pinned to a given sector long enough for Allied forces to exploit a weak flank elsewhere. By late-stage operations in Western Europe, Axis Command relied on mobile reserves, Panzer and Panzer Grenadier formations, to counter breakthroughs. For the Allies, the ability to divert one or more of these reserves, even temporarily, could determine whether a local offensive succeeded with minimal casualties. Operation Brest's planners sought to manufacture the image of an imminent major assault in the Brest sector, so the German High Command would refrain from sending their armor to the adjacent sector under real attack. Intelligence and target selection. Planners selected Brest because of its terrain, known enemy aerial reconnaissance patterns, and the presence of German listening posts within range of their proposed audio play. Intelligence indicated that Luftwaffe reconnaissance sorties in the area flew predictable paths in the morning and late afternoon. Enemy signal units were known to monitor frequencies that would be amenable by spoofing by a mobile radio net. That combination of factors made Brest a suitable target for a multimodal deception.
Operational design and the package. The deception package combined 1. A dense array of inflatable tanks and mock artillery placed in fields visible from the likely flight corridors. 2. Concealed speaker arrays along hedgerows to simulate the passage and idling of armored formations. 3. A layered radio net employing believable call signs, periodic situation updates, and occasional simulated fire control chatter. 4. Ancillary evidence like staged vehicle tracks, scattered empty crates, and improvised bivouac items to add ground verisimilitude. Each element was designed to cross-validate the others. Photo interpreters would see tanks, listening posts would hear engines, SIGINT analysts would intercept radio chatter. The planners understood that cross-modal corroboration produced exponentially greater credence than any single cue. Execution phase, choreography, and timing. Execution required military discipline and theatrical timing. Crews moved in under cover of night, carried deflated inflatables and painted frames in trucks, and began assembly at pre-selected sites. Inflatable mock Shermans were oriented according to calculated sun angles so that aircraft shots taken in the morning would yield realistic shadows. Teams then created track marks and scattered appropriate detritus to simulate a recent encampment. Sound teams deployed generators 3 hedgerows back, running cables to horn speakers concealed by brush. Antenna masts, non-functional but visually authentic, were set at several positions to imply command posts. Radio operators established nets about half a mile from the decoys and began a schedule of scripted updates timed to correlate with anticipated reconnaissance flights. Pre-recorded tapes of engine starts and column movements were run with volume ramping. The combined sonic and visual scene was rehearsed with a friendly aircraft. Technicians adjusted EQ and speaker phasing until observers in the aircraft reported an authentic presence. Enemy reaction and decision-making. As predicted, an enemy reconnaissance sortie photographed the staged formations. Intercepts recorded radio chatter with consistent call sign patterns. Enemy analysts, integrating the photo and signal data, assessed a high likelihood of offensive preparations in the Brest sector and recommended the reallocation of mechanized reserves to defend against an anticipated attack. German commanders, already wary because of pressure on multiple fronts, chose to hold significant armored resources in the area rather than release them elsewhere. Operational outcome and impact assessment. The deception successfully fixed a panzer division in the Brest zone for nearly 48 to 72 hours, time the Allies used to concentrate forces and achieve a local breakthrough in the neighboring sector. By the time the Germans realized their error, Allied forces had consolidated gains and exploited the reduced resistance on the actual axis of advance. Casualty reports later indicated lower friendly losses than expected for a frontal operation of that magnitude. From a cost-benefit perspective, the material investment in Operation Brest was small. Nylon inflatables, a few generators, speakers, and manpower. But the operational payoff was substantial in terms of maneuvers enabled and lives saved.
Lessons learned from Brest. Operation Brest showcased critical principles. Cross-modal corroboration is the strongest form of deception. Visuals, audio, and signal traffic together create a narrative too coherent to dismiss. The human decision-making timeline matters. Deception achieves strategic effect not by permanently fooling the enemy, but by slowing their decision cycle or redirecting assets during windows of vulnerability. Simplicity and logistical speed trumped theatrical perfection. Rapid deployment and believable detail mattered more than perfect fidelity. Case Study B. Distraction and misidentification. Operation Metz. Radio and acoustic deception to mislead tactical reconnaissance and create false targets. Objective and strategic context. Operation Metz focused on misidentification rather than fixation. The goal here was to convince German tactical reconnaissance that a series of minor movements were, in fact, the assembling of a mechanized thrust that would open toward a different axis. Metz was designed to create a false pattern of activity across several localities so that enemy reconnaissance resources would be wasted collecting and verifying multiple false positives, thereby degrading the quality of intelligence and reducing the tempo of enemy countermeasures. Intelligence and environmental advantages. Planners selected a pattern of small villages and crossroads that lay within auditory range of multiple enemy listening posts and within the photographic lines of local reconnaissance aircraft. The environment favored acoustic deception because low rolling hills and valley corridors channeled sound toward enemy positions. Reconnaissance schedules in the area also had predictable periodicity that the Ghost Army used to its advantage. Operation design. The deception package emphasized numerous small acoustic plays that suggested multiple simultaneous motor movements, engine startups, convoy roll-offs, and brief bivouac activity. Sparse visual cues distributed across several fields, small numbers of decoy trucks and light vehicles, rather than heavy armor, to minimize the risk of ground verification.
and a set of short-lived radio nets that appeared and disappeared, mimicking the fluidity of forward reconnaissance elements communicating fleeting situational updates. Execution and operational tempo. METs relied on tempo and distribution. Rather than a single massing event, the deception involved simultaneous short plays across a broad area. Sound teams drove to multiple staging points, ran brief but convincing audio sequences, and drove to the next point to repeat the performance. The aim was to create a mosaic of suspicious activity that would force the enemy to poll multiple grid squares before taking action.
Radio teams synchronized brief bursts of traffic with the acoustic plays. The radio chatter was intentionally ephemeral. Short transits of call signs, rapid situation checks, and terse mission updates that matched the expected behavior of reconnaissance elements or probing motorized units. Because these nets were transient, enemy analysts had to choose whether to commit resources to verify each signal or to treat them as low-confidence noise. The pattern of multiplicity increased the chance of misallocation because the enemy prioritized persistent and corroborated threats. METs forced them to elevate many threats temporarily. Enemy response and the fog of verification. The cumulative effect was a degradation of the enemy's operational picture. Field commanders and air reconnaissance resources were parceled out across the mosaic of suspicious zones, while artillery and airstrike planners hesitated to commit in-depth strikes without higher confidence intelligence. German units reported inconsistent sightings, some photographic evidence that was ambiguous, some intercepted chatter that correlated with one village but not another. This inconsistency created hesitation at higher command levels that slowed the enemy's reaction time to the real Allied operation elsewhere. Operational outcome and assessment. Operation METS succeeded in creating a tactical fog by dispersing the enemy's reconnaissance assets and generating multiple misleading reports. Allied forces were able to exploit reduced situational clarity and move more freely in the actual main effort area. The cost in material resources for METS was small, but the need for repeated short plays demanded high logistical flexibility and endurance from deception crews. METS highlighted the value of information overload as a weapon. By creating too many plausible threats, the deception forced the enemy to prioritize, often incorrectly. Lessons learned from METS. Multiplicity increases cognitive load. When faced with many plausible threats, decision-makers must prioritize, which sometimes leads to misallocation. Short, distributed plays can be more effective than a single ground spectacle when the strategic objective is delay or confusion. Transient radio traffic is a powerful tool if matched precisely to the acoustic and photographic environment. Case Study C. Concealment of a river crossing. Operation Rhine. Integrated sustained deception to protect a major maneuver. Objective and strategic context. Crossing a major river under enemy observation is one of the most delicate and dangerous operations in land warfare. In Operation Rhine, planners aimed to conceal the true crossing point of a major Allied river assault, drawing enemy attention and reserves to a nearby sector, while allowing the main force to cross at a weaker, less defended point. This operation required sustained deception over several days to cover preparation, the crossing itself, and immediate consolidation on the far bank. Intelligence and the criticality of timing. Rhine's planners needed precise intelligence about enemy patrol patterns, aerial reconnaissance windows, and the location of field fortifications. Because river crossing operations require heavy preparation, bridging equipment, ferrying craft, concentrations of infantry and armor in staging areas, the Ghost Army had to generate a credible alternative focal point that could plausibly be the actual crossing. This operation therefore became a test case in sustained, integrated deception, visual, audio, radio, feints by actual small covering forces, and controlled leakage of misleading logistics indicators, fake supply dumps, staged bridge construction materials. Operational design.
a mosaic of continuous plays. The deception was designed with several reinforcing components. 1. A persistent visual presence, mock bridges, decoy bridgeheads, mock ferries, and inflatable craft staged at the false site to simulate crossing preparations. These were arrayed over a series of fields so that aerial reconnaissance would repeatedly photograph evidence suggesting imminent river crossing. 2. A continuous acoustic drama. Sound teams kept a rotating schedule of engine noises, deployment sounds, and simulated bridge work, creating a constant impression of sustained activity. 3. An active radio net that mimicked higher-level crossing coordination traffic, including engineer requests, supply schedule confirmations, and battalion-level situation reports. Radio traffic was designed to be credible under scrutiny and repeated throughout the day and night cycles. 4. Real ground movements by small diversionary units working in concert to lend tangible proof for observers who might cross-check photographic and radio evidence with ground patrol reports. Execution, endurance, concealment, and tradecraft. Operation Rhine demanded endurance. Where many deception plays were short bursts, a river crossing demanded days of sustained activity with small rotations to avoid detection. The Ghost Army staged rotating sound crews, alternate decoy formations to avoid wear, and carefully managed generator refueling and maintenance schedules. Concealment of true bridging elements was managed through strict light and movement discipline, camouflaged storage of bridging components, and nocturnal river crossing techniques for the real assault units. Meanwhile, the decoy site maintained the show. Visible bridge piers that were weathered and painted, anchored inflatable ferries bobbing in the water, and conspicuous engineer tents, enemy reaction and resource diversion. The deception succeeded in convincing German local commanders of a major crossing at the decoy site. Command moved anti-tank reserves and artillery assets to defend the apparent bridgehead. Air reconnaissance continued to visit the false site to monitor activities. The result was a significant thinning of enemy assets opposite the real crossing point, where Allied engineers and the assault troops exploited the reduced defenses to establish a bridgehead rapidly with fewer casualties and less time under direct fire than would have been expected had the enemy concentrated on the true crossing. Operational outcome and strategic consequences. Operation Rhine stands as an archetype of sustained deception integrated with maneuver. By protecting the actual crossing and enabling faster consolidation on the far bank, the deception shortened the time required to secure the crossing, accelerated the tempo of follow-on operations, and reduced casualties. The operation demonstrated the strategic leverage of deception, modest physical investments leveraged into decisive maneuver benefits. Lessons learned from Rhine. Sustained deception requires endurance and careful logistics. It is resource-intensive, even if it does not consume heavy steel. Integration with real maneuver forces is essential. Deception cannot be purely theatrical if it aims to protect a complex operation. The psychological burden on enemy commanders can be exploited. When faced with credible crossing evidence, even cautious commanders tend to commit reserves rather than allow risk. This risk aversion can be manipulated. Cross-cutting analysis. Why the Ghost Army's operations worked. Across these cases, several common mechanisms emerge that explain the Ghost Army's effectiveness. 1. Multimodal corroboration. In every successful operation, visual, audio, and signals cues reinforced one another. This cross-validation increased the enemy's confidence in the false picture and reduced the chance the deception would be dismissed as a single-sensor anomaly. 2. Timing and decision cycle manipulation. The Ghost Army exploited the gap between observation and reaction. Deception did not need to fool the enemy permanently. It only needed to influence decisions during critical time windows. By aligning plays with enemy reconnaissance schedules and decision timelines, planners created maximum impact. 3. Minimal but convincing physical evidence. Deception success was rooted in achieving good enough realism. Small details, tracks, empty tins, accurate shadows were more important than perfect fidelity. These low-cost cues produced outsized credibility. 4. Flexibility and speed. The ability to deploy, adapt, and withdraw quickly kept deception operations safe and reduced the risk of ground verification by enemy patrols. 5. Psychological realism. Operators deliberately mimicked human errors, noise, and procedural quirks. Authentic imperfection was a consistent theme across cases. It reduced suspicion rather than increasing it. Concluding remarks on Part 5. The Ghost Army's actions were not one-off pranks or novelty displays. They were operational instruments, deliberate, rehearsed, and integrated into higher-level campaigns. The case studies show that deception can be more than tactical misdirection. It can be an operational multiplier that reshapes enemy dispositions, reduces casualties, and accelerates tempo. Where raw force is costly and slow, the strategic use of perception can be swift and efficient. Understanding these historical episodes clarifies why modern military thinkers continued to study the tactics and tradecraft of the Ghost Army. Their legacy is not only in the objects they inflated and the tapes they played, but in the essential lesson that in war, what the enemy believes is often as consequential as what actually exists on the ground. Deception is not a purely technical problem, it is a psychological one. The tools of the Ghost Army, inflatables, speakers, radio nets, staged tracks, are methods for manipulating what other people believe about reality. To make those beliefs change, operators needed more than good props. They needed an operational understanding of human perception, decision-making under stress, organizational incentives, and the specific cognitive patterns that dominated German military analysis in 1944-1945. This chapter breaks down that psychology in concrete terms: the sensory and cognitive processes involved, the institutional constraints on enemy decision-makers, the heuristics that led Wehrmacht commanders to accept illusions as reality, and why small informational nudges could produce outsized operational effects. 1. The basic problem: information scarcity and noisy sensors. No army has perfect knowledge. A reconnaissance photo is a snapshot. A listening post hears fragments, and human reports are biased and delayed. Commanders make decisions using imperfect, asynchronous, and sometimes contradictory inputs. That is the essential vulnerability deception exploits. The Ghost Army created consistent, multi-sensory signals that reduced perceived ambiguity for the enemy. The same story appeared in sight, sound, and signal channels. Humans prefer coherent narratives. When multiple sources tell a consistent story, confidence rises even if the evidence is individually weak. This is cognitive coherence at work. From a technical standpoint, every piece of military intelligence is a noisy signal superimposed on background noise. The job of an analyst is to infer the state of the world given those signals. Deception increases the signal-to-noise ratio of a false state by injecting correlating cues across channels. The result is that a false hypothesis attains the same evidentiary weight as a true one. In simple terms, when the enemy's inputs align, they act. That alignment was the core of Ghost Army efficacy. 2. Expectation and confirmation bias. Two psychological phenomena are central. First, expectation. Interpreters see what they expect to see. If German doctrine and prior reports suggested the Allies would concentrate armor before an offensive, intelligence officers were primed to interpret ambiguous imagery as tanks. Expectation narrows perceptual interpretation. Second, confirmation bias. Once a hypothesis, for example, Allies preparing armor near Sector X, takes shape, interpreters prioritize information that confirms it,
and downplay contrary clues. The Ghost Army's multimodal presentation created an initial hypothesis and then flooded the environment with confirmatory evidence, making the bias self-reinforcing. A practical illustration. A reconnaissance photograph with vague dark shapes in a field is ambiguous on its own. If, in the same window, listening posts register engine rumble and SIGINT captures radio chatter with armored call signs, analysts perceive the three inputs as mutually confirming. The result is a higher confidence estimate for the armored attack hypothesis and a higher likelihood of decision-makers committing reserves or changing plans. 3. Heuristics under time pressure. Field commanders do not have infinite time. Heuristics, rules of thumb, guide fast decisions. Simple heuristics can be remarkably effective, but they are also exploitable. One relevant heuristic is corroboration equals truth. Multiple independent signals increase trust. Deception leverages that heuristic by artificially producing independent-looking signals. Another is err on the side of caution. When uncertainty is high and stakes are high, commanders often prefer the safer hinge, commit reserves to protect a threatened sector, rather than risk leaving a flank open. Ghost Army planners understood this risk aversion and designed illusions that made a cautious response appear rational. Time pressure also leads to satisficing, making a good enough decision rather than an optimal one. If incoming intelligence suggests a 60 to 70% probability of an imminent attack and reinforcements are available, the satisficing decision will often be to reinforce. Ghost Army operations increased perceived attack probability into the satisficing zone, triggering defensive moves that were operationally costly to the Germans. 4. The role of organizational incentives and career risk. Military organizations shape decision-making through incentives. For German commanders in 1944-45, the costs of underreacting to an apparent Allied concentration were severe. A breakthrough could be blamed on negligence. Conversely, overreacting by holding back reserves could be embarrassing, but less immediately catastrophic to personal careers, particularly when central command demanded caution. This asymmetric risk structure biases commanders toward defensive allocation when uncertain. Ghost Army deception exploited that organizational conservatism. Commanders chose to keep formations in place rather than gamble on their absence. In practical terms, if the intelligence picture suggested a plausible Allied massing opposite Sector A, moving the Panzer Reserve to Sector B carried career risk if the main assault was actually at Sector A. The perceived political and military penalties for misallocation made deception more effective than it would be in an organization that rewarded risk-taking. 5. Sensory gating and the primacy of multisensory corroboration. Human perception integrates multiple modalities to create a coherent scene. The Ghost Army targeted exactly this integrative process. Visual cues are powerful, but in isolation, they can be doubted. Sound provides temporal continuity. Radio provides organizational identity. When all three align, the brain's natural tendency is to fuse them into a single narrative. From the enemy's perspective, the resulting internal representation was not, "we see a photo and hear a tape," but rather, "there is an armored force at grid X." The cognitive process of sensory gating, privileging correlated multisensory inputs, was the core vulnerability. This is why cross-modal deception was so effective. A photo alone might be discounted. A tape alone might be mapped to local motor noise. But a photo plus tape plus radio produced a percept that humans treat as stronger evidence than the sum of its parts. 6. Signal detection theory and thresholds for action. Signal detection theory offers a formal lens. Decision-makers set thresholds to decide whether a signal is present given noise and costs of false alarms versus misses. Deception operations aim to push a false signal over that threshold. The Ghost Army did this not by making each signal perfect, but by stacking multiple weak signals in time and modality
until the overall likelihood crossed operational thresholds. Because the costs of a false alarm, for example, moving reserves unnecessarily, were often judged lower than the cost of a miss, a real surprise attack, German thresholds favored defensive responses under ambiguous but corroborated inputs. 7. The role of narrative and cognitive closure. Humans prefer closure, resolving uncertainty into a story that allows action. A well-crafted deception tells a clear story. The Allies are massing armor, calling in engineers, and making radio plans. That story makes the enemy's decision problem tractable. Instead of wrestling with ambiguous data, commanders could adopt a working narrative and act. Deception's power is in turning the fog of war into a plausible narrative that channels action. Ghost Army operations generated such narratives repeatedly and reliably.
8. The psychology of expectation management and escalation. Deception is also an exercise in expectation management. If the enemy expects activity in a particular season, locality, or defensive posture, then presenting consistent supporting evidence is more effective than bizarre, out-of-context displays. The Ghost Army rarely attempted wildly implausible fictions. Instead, they tailored allusions to match known German expectations, typical Allied doctrine, historical patterns of movement, and seasonal operational norms. Plausibility reduced cognitive dissonance and eased acceptance. Escalation dynamics matter too. A small allusion that seems plausible can be gradually amplified. For example, an initial fake bivouac might be low confidence. If subsequent listening posts report engine rumble and SIGINT peaks up the supposed unit, commanders escalate their response. The Ghost Army designed deception chains to initiate this escalation cascade deliberately. 9. Emotional and morale factors, fear, fatigue, and threat salience. Cognitive biases are amplified by emotion. In late war Germany, commanders faced resource shortages, relentless pressure, and morale problems. Stress makes people more likely to accept simple explanations that justify caution. An apparent new Allied formation becomes a salient threat because it fits emotional preconceptions. We are under attack. Fatigue reduces the appetite for careful, skeptical analysis. Soldiers and analysts under strain opt for expedient judgments. Ghost Army operations often timed plays to exploit such emotional vulnerabilities during nights of heavy bombardment, after supply shortages, or when units were under sustained pressure, because under those conditions, even marginal evidence was likely to trigger defensive reactions. 10. Case microanalyses. How psychology translated to operational decisions. 2 microanalyses illustrate the cognitive chain. Example 1. Aerial photo plus radionet. The photo is ambiguous, the radionet is active. An analyst forms an initial 60% belief in an armored presence. Organizational incentives and the asymmetric cost of a miss push the commander's operational threshold lower. He commits a panzer reserve to the sector. Result: resources are diverted, leaving the real axis weaker. Example 2. Night listening post plus repeated audio plays. Night listening posts detect engine rumble and distant metallic clanks. The acoustic pattern suggests movement on an axis. The post sends a report. Command elevates the sector's threat level, rerouting air recon and artillery. The cumulative reassignment of assets produces operational gaps elsewhere. These microprocesses are simple. Perception leads to beliefs. Beliefs interact with incentives and heuristics. Decisions follow, and material consequences occur. The Ghost Army's genius was structuring sensory inputs to reliably trigger those microprocesses. 11. Social proof, authority cues, and inter-organizational corroboration. Social proof amplifies deception. If multiple independent German units report similar sightings, higher command becomes more confident. Ghost Army planners often sought to create the conditions where local reports would multiply, by staging visual cues visible to patrolling aircraft, and by making listening posts' acoustic detections likely. Authority cues also matter. Intercepts that appear to come from higher echelon nets carry more weight, although the Ghost Army deliberately avoided forging high-level encrypted messages, too risky. Their call sign engineering sometimes constructed believable higher echelon procedure that fed into the social proof loop.
12. Limits. When psychology fails, and why some deceptions were discovered. Psychology is fallible. Deceptions failed when contradictory hard evidence arrived. Eyewitness reports from ground patrols, reconnaissance that photographed the same area at close range and saw no real vehicles, or when analysts applied skeptical, methodical cross-checks, triangulation of DF bearings on radio sources, comparing photo series at different times. Some German units developed countermeasures, persistent surveillance, targeted ground probes, and practices to deliberately test suspicious signatures. Deception works best when the enemy has limited capacity to do these checks quickly. Another failure mode, overconfidence induced by repeated successful deceptions, can lead to complacency. If a command system becomes habituated to believing early signals are true, it may be caught by a genuine surprise later. But in practice, the Ghost Army rarely produced strategic surprises on the scale that would harm Allied objectives. Its operations were designed to shift local resource allocations, not produce systemic collapse. 14. Comparisons. Ghost Army psychology versus other forms of psychological warfare. The Ghost Army's approach differs from broad propaganda or strategic misinformation in scope and method. Propaganda aims at attitudes and morale over time. Ghost Army deception was tactical and immediate, aimed at specific operational decisions. Its psychological leverage came from sensory coherence and organizational effects rather than persuasive rhetoric. In modern terms, it is closer to targeted influence operations that manipulate situational awareness than to mass information campaigns. 15. Ethical and moral considerations in manipulating perceptions of war. Deception in war raises moral questions. Is it legitimate to manipulate enemy perceptions? Historically, deception has always been part of warfare, from feigned retreats to camouflaged fortifications. The Ghost Army's methods fall into that long tradition. Ethically, the operations aimed to reduce casualties by avoiding frontal attrition and forcing the enemy to misallocate resources. From a consequentialist perspective, deception that reduces bloodshed on both sides can be morally defensible. Nevertheless, deception risks unintended consequences, including harm to civilians if misdirected strikes occur as a result of false information, or escalation if deception provokes disproportionate reactions. Planners needed to weigh these risks when designing operations. 15. Takeaways for commanders and intelligence analysts. Several practical lessons emerge for decision-makers. 1. Corroboration is necessary but not sufficient. Multiple signals can be manufactured. Analysts should evaluate the independence of sources. 2. Consider adversary incentives. A commander's choice often depends on career, organizational pressure, and risk asymmetry. Deception exploits these. 3. Use active testing. Where possible, use targeted probes or low-cost verification methods, short-range reconnaissance, targeting DF on radio sources, to test high-stakes intelligence before major reallocation. 4. Anticipate multisensory deception. Analysts should train in recognizing cross-modal false correlations and examine whether the supposed independent channels could have been arranged by an adversary.
The Ghost Army's legacy is complicated. On one hand, it was a tactical and operational tool that saved lives by misdirecting German forces. On the other, it became a methodological blueprint that shaped how the U.S. military, and later NATO, conceptualized deception, psychological effects, electromagnetic shaping, and battlefield storytelling. The unit did not simply create military camouflage. It created a theory, one that persists today under different names: information advantage, shaping perception, non-kinetic mass, and cognitive domain operations. To understand this legacy,
we must trace how Ghost Army methods influenced U.S. doctrine after 1945, how Cold War planners studied its work, how modern units, from PSYOP battalions to cyber commands, apply lessons in different mediums, and why the story's delayed declassification, 1996 officially, trickling into mass media decades later, deeply influenced the mythic aura around these operations. 1. Why the secrecy lasted so long. Many ask, why wasn't the Ghost Army publicly known for decades? The short answer, because deception techniques remained sensitive. The U.S. military did not want adversaries to see how effects were achieved. Inflatable tanks are not classified. The method, cross-sensory convergence to shape adversary decisions, is. Deception operations require understanding the enemy's sensor chains, knowing their doctrine and decision thresholds, exploiting their biases. Those are evergreen tools. During early Cold War planning, the Pentagon saw value in keeping deception methodologies classified. NATO faced Warsaw Pact forces who used deep echelon formations, heavy SIGINT, and operational-level armor. Telling them how U.S. deception had worked would make countermeasures easier. 2. Post-war institutionalization. Ghost Army veterans were quietly consulted in the late 1940s and early 1950s by early PSYOP and military deception cells. Some never knew to what extent their wartime creativity influenced doctrine. Others went into advertising, industrial design, stage design, media, and cross-pollinated their wartime skills into American cultural industries. The U.S. Army developed formal doctrine, FM 90-2, Battlefield Deception, an early Cold War text. Later, FM 3-13, Information Operations, and modern Joint Doctrine, the Cognitive Domain. These are not direct reprints of Ghost Army practice, but the conceptual lineage is visible. For example, the doctrine that multiple weak indicators can outweigh a single strong one is essentially Ghost Army theory codified into joint language. 3. Influence on specific Cold War deception concepts. During exercises in West Germany, Reforger cycles, 1960s through 1980s, NATO forces routinely used decoys, false radio nets, and exercise storylines. U.S. planners recognized that Soviets had large SIGINT and photo recon networks. Luring attention away from real axes of maneuver could create windows of maneuver advantage. This continuity proves the Ghost Army was not an oddity. It was a precursor. 4. Modern parallels, the electromagnetic domain. In modern conflict, the radio net component of Ghost Army work is now called electromagnetic signature shaping. Military units now manipulate emissions patterns, timing of transmissions, spread spectrum artifacts, and spoofed network identities. The goal is the same: show the opponent the force you want them to think exists. When electronic warfare units create convincingly structured traffic on a spectrum waterfall display, they are doing a high-tech version of what Ghost Army operators did while manually keying fake nets on World War II radios. 5. Modern parallels, cyber domain. In cyber warfare, decoys appear as honeypots, dummy servers, decoy routing, false metadata, simulated users, illusions in digital space. The psychology is the same. Create a threat picture that drives enemy behavior. Ghost Army equals first generation. Cyber deception equals fourth generation. The domain changed, the principle did not. 6. Modern parallels, special effects, and Hollywood. Here is where the legacy becomes cultural. Ghost Army members were the first recorded U.S. military outfit to systematically use stagecraft as an operational instrument. Inflatable tanks were essentially props. Engineers measured paint tone to match M4 Sherman hues at 1 kilometer. That is set design, not armament. Veterans later entered Madison Avenue advertising, industrial design firms, Hollywood art departments. The separation between art and military narrowed. Ghost Army operations showed that aesthetic skill, color theory, proportion, shadowing, could create military value. Today, when Hollywood uses hyper-realistic CGI for historical war films to recreate large formations that never existed physically, it is spiritually similar, shaping perception through aesthetic illusion. 7. Influence on U.S. Special Operations Command. Modern U.S. SOCOM studies adversary decision-making in a systematic way. In internal briefs, planners talk about narrative surface, the set of beliefs adversaries currently hold, and how those beliefs can be pushed. That is Ghost Army logic. Deception is no longer props on the battlefield. It is now micro-targeted messaging, timed information leaks, spoofed sensor inputs, data flooding, false traffic injection. The line from 1944 to 2025 is straight. They shaped decision-making with rubber tanks. Modern units shape decision-making with information packets. 8. Why the Ghost Army is uniquely American. This is important for an American-targeted audience. Yes, Soviet Maskirovka existed. Yes, British had deception groups. But the Ghost Army reflects a uniquely American cultural trait, turning creativity into operational power. The U.S. has a deep tradition of applied art, industrial design, Hollywood, engineering improvisation, consumer advertising. The Ghost Army weaponized American creative industries against the Wehrmacht. In other words, it was not just military deception. It was American creativity weaponized. 9. The emotional legacy. Veterans of the Ghost Army often described satisfaction that their work saved lives without killing directly. They understood their work manipulated fear and belief, but they saw that as sparing casualties. They did not fire artillery. They did not storm trenches. Their battlefield was inside the enemy's interpretation of the battlefield.
Many said decades later, "We fought with brains instead of bullets." That line is cliched, but it is accurate. Their mission space was cognitive. 10. Lessons for future commanders. The lesson is not build more inflatables. The lesson is always consider what the enemy thinks they see. And more importantly, give them a coherent story that leads to a decision you desire. That is the Ghost Army's formula. The 21st century is full of cheap sensors, drones, open-source imagery, social media, commercial SIGINT. That means deception is even more important, because the more data there is, the more chances to manipulate interpretation. 11. The meta lesson. War is a competition to shape perception. Firepower kills. Maneuver positions. Logistics sustains. But perception guides all three. Ghost Army operations show that one does not need to match enemy divisions physically. One must match enemy divisions psychologically. If the enemy believes there are 4 armored divisions in a sector, and they act on that belief, then, for practical purposes, those divisions existed in operational terms. This is one of the most profound military truths of the entire war. Conclusion. The Ghost Army was not simply a quirky footnote of World War II. It was an inflection point in the evolution of military thought. It demonstrated that deception can be industrialized, engineered, systematized, and purpose-built. It proved that aesthetic illusion is not frivolous. It is a tool of war, and it left behind methodological DNA that the U.S. military continues to use in cyber operations, electromagnetic shaping, psychological influence, and information warfare.